A reading from the Gospel according to St. Luke, chapter 9, beginning at verse 28 on to verse 43. Luke 9, verse 28 and following. About 8 days after Jesus said this, he took Peter, John, and James with him and went up onto a mountain to pray. As he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. 2 men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor talking with Jesus. They spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. Peter and his companions were very sleepy, but when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men standing with him. As the men were leaving Jesus, Peter said to him, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what he was saying. While he was speaking, a cloud appeared and enveloped them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. A voice came from the cloud saying, "This is my son whom I have chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, they found that Jesus was alone. The disciples kept this to themselves and told no one at that time what they had seen. The next day, when they came down from the mountain, a large crowd met them. A man in the crowd called out, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son, for he is my only child. A spirit seizes him, and he suddenly screams. It throws him into convulsions so that he foams at the mouth. It scarcely ever leaves him and is destroying him. I begged your disciples to drive it out, but they could not." "Oh, believing and perverse generation," Jesus replied, "how long shall I stay with you and put up with you? Bring your son here." Even while the boy was coming, the demon threw him to the ground in a convulsion. But Jesus rebuked the evil spirit, healed the boy, and gave him back to his father. And they were all amazed at the greatness of God. Ponder again verse 40. The words of the distraught father. "I begged your disciples to drive it out, but they could not." I begged your disciples to drive it out, but they could not. Today in Christendom all over the world is being observed and celebrated as Transfiguration Sunday. It is one in a line of events in the life of Christ that the church celebrates, beginning with Advent, through to Christmas, through to the Epiphany, when Christ's glory was made clear to the Gentiles, the so-called kings, the Magi, who came from the east, through to his baptism a few weeks ago, now his transfiguration, and then soon his passion, and then his resurrection. And if you don't see the thread of light, the glory of Christ in all of these, then you've missed the boat. Today is Transfiguration Sunday, one of the great Christian feasts, as it is called. And the reading you just heard, which if you remember in the context of the Old Testament reading you heard, both of them are readings from the lectionary for today. It's a very fascinating episode that we've just read and which we've just recounted. Jesus is still relatively at the beginning of his ministry here in Luke. And he decides to do what he always does. He decides to go aside to pray. For some reason, he takes only 3 of the 12 disciples. He goes up into this mountain to pray. And as he begins to pray, his countenance changes. Not that he becomes unrecognizable, but there's a brilliance that attends him. And then, as if that were not enough, 2 figures appear with him, both of them also enveloped in a dazzling kind of light. Peter and his friends are sleepy, or as some commentaries say, they were in fact asleep and then awakened. And picture this. They're coming out of a deep sleep. And as they look at these 3 figures, they're a bit confused. And Peter is the only one who speaks, and we know that the others are confused based on what Luke says about Peter and based on what Peter says. So there it is. You're waking up, and you see 3 figures enveloped in light. One is a lustrous Jesus. One is showbiz Moses. And one is an Elijah on fire. And they're all viewed by sleepy Petey. And Peter does what he does best. He begins to speak. He begins to talk. A little bit out of turn, as sometimes usual. And even Luke says he didn't know what he was saying. Masters, it's great. What we're witnessing here is wonderful. By translation, let's stay here forever. Let's build 3 monuments, 3 memorials for you, for Elijah, and for Moses. And of course, when we build this, who will maintain them? The 3 of us. We'll stay here forever with you. I suspect that was the implication. But as he spoke those words, the cloud comes and envelops Elijah on fire, showbiz Moses, and lustrous Jesus. And a voice comes from the cloud. The cloud disappears and only Jesus remains. And the voice is the voice of God. This is my beloved Son. Listen to him. And the word alone might be redundant, but it would be effective if it were added. Listen to him. Meanwhile, down the mountain, at the bottom of the hill, there are 9 disciples who are facing a meltdown with a letdown. A man with a troubled boy, a son, brings this boy, his life battered with evil forces, with physical manifestations. The father brings this boy to the 9 disciples remaining down the hill and begs them, pleads with them, take him out. Deal with it for me. And the word in verse 40 is that they could not. I begged your disciples to drive it out. When Jesus and Peter, James, and John come down the mountain and find this other episode in progress, the man looks at Jesus and brings him up to speed with what's going on. I begged your disciples to drive it out, but they could not. I want to suggest that despite all the hype even we make often, and we use scripture verses to raise the hype, don't we? I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. That's one of the favorites that we use to pump ourselves up into saying, hey, we can do anything. Never mind with Christ, yes, we add that because that's what the scripture says. But very often I think we delude ourselves into a non-reality that we've made a reality, which in turn wreaks havoc with our everyday living and which contributes, I suggest, to a lot of people bowing out of Christendom, bowing out of the church. What's that? I am suggesting that what we read here in this text is the normal, run-of-the-mill Christianity, normal following Jesus, normal discipleship. I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not. That is normal. So on the front of your bulletins, you see the word failure. And if you haven't read it yet, don't read it now. You'll miss what I'm going to say. Take it home and read the story. I suspect lots of you don't read it, right? But read it. We're not trying to lift failure up on a pedestal, and you can read the rest of it. But I suggest to you that in this text, a story about failure, we find the normal life that all of us live. And if we try to buck that, if we try to deny that, we are setting ourselves up for massive delusion and massive frustration. And the worst comes when we say, this Jesus thing doesn't make sense, and it's a fraud, and we bow out of it. There are too many people in the world who have taken that approach and have made that bad decision. So what's in this story for us? Well, we want to say three things. First of all, we want to say that in the normal story of discipleship, which is what this text tells us about, and which I am putting to you that we live in the normal story of discipleship, in the normal story of Jesus following, to which all of us, I hope, subscribe. There is human limitation. There is human limitation. I begged your disciples to cast him. And if you're thinking that if Peter, James, and John were there, if it was all 12, that it would have been different, you just don't get it yet. In fact, there could have been 24 disciples, 36 disciples, 48, 72, any multiple. The story would be, the result would be the same. I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not, to drive it out, but they could not. In the normal course of following Jesus, there is human limitation. They could not deal with a problem before them. So it is that they had neither the ability, that's the suggestion, they did not have the ability to drive it out, and because they did not have the ability to deal with the problem before them, and look, any major problem, let's use this demon-possessed boy's condition to go past that. Let's not narrowly see it just as that. Let's use it to represent any massive problem that faces you and that faces people you know just like me and you. Right? They did not have the ability, and because they did not have the ability to cast it out, they did not have the accomplishment of casting it out. You see? If they did not have the ability to cast it out, they could not have the accomplishment or the achievement. They were a failure. Or at least, if you don't want to call them a failure, they faced failure. Failure was right there in their face. They could not deal with it because they did not have the ability. And because they did not have the ability, the aim eluded them. The achievement was beyond their grasp. And there are really two reasons for that. The first is that they were still learning. These were early days. They were Jesus' disciples. And the long and short of that is that Jesus was trying to fashion them, to mold them to become like him. Good luck with that, Jesus. But it was still early days. And you know as well as I do that even at the end of the 3 years, they still probably would not have managed this. If this episode were happening at the end of his ministry, the result would probably be still the same. But let's cut them some slack and say that at least the problem here was that this was still early days yet. So they were still learning. They were still learning. Because they were early students, we could argue that because they were still just beginning, they couldn't drive this demon out. But there was a second problem. Not only were they still learning, but they were still lacking. What were they lacking? They were lacking the Spirit. They were still empty, you see. So they were still learning. It was early days yet. And they were still lacking. They were empty of the Spirit. That is why the rebuke that Jesus gives is not directed at his disciples. It is directed at the people, and we will come to that in a minute. It was to the people who were expecting these men to cast this demon out that Jesus leveled the words that he declared later or in response. "Oh, believing and perverse generation, how long shall I stay with you and put up with you?" And if we might jump the gun, he was saying this to the people who expected the disciples to do what they could not do because they did not have the Spirit. And they didn't ask the one who did at that time, who was Jesus. We'll come to that in a minute. But the disciples could not cast this demon out. What do these two reasons for the disciples' inability to cast out this demon say to us? What do we need to remember when we say that the normal story about, or the story about normal discipleship, normal Christian life, is a story about human limitations. What do we need to say to ourselves? We need to say to ourselves that we must cut ourselves some slack. We need to say to ourselves that we must know and constantly assess our limitations because we have them. And we must make sure that we do not use scripture texts like, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, to plunge our heads into the sand in denial that we have limitations. We must not do that. Because that's not what that verse is meant to do and meant to say. And we must watch how we delude ourselves into thinking that we must get something done and work ourselves to frazzle when we can't do it. And therefore, what I have to say to you at the end of this first point is just what Paul says to the Philippians when he writes them: do not be anxious about anything, but relax. Because if you have a limitation and you have an inability, you lack the ability to do the thing, which therefore means that you will also lack the achievement. Don't worry, everything going to be all right. Just accept the limitation. It doesn't make sense to try harder. You lack the ability. It doesn't make sense to knock your head on the wall. It's not going to happen so far. But that's only the first point. Stay with me. There's a second thing that this text tells us. I begged your disciples to drive it out, but they could not. The story, the normal story about discipleship, or the story about normal Jesus following, normal life, which all of us live, is not only a story about human limitation, but it's also a story about human expectation. It's clearly there. The man brings his son to Jesus' disciples. I mean, it's Jesus. This is still early, but by now, the fame of Jesus and these 12 men had gone abroad. That's why this man brings his son to these disciples in Jesus' absence while Jesus is up on a mountain becoming shiny. He brings this boy because he has an expectation. And I don't know what the disciples said to him, the 9 of them. I don't know what the disciples did, but I do know that whatever they said or did communicated clearly to this man that his expectations were just dashed. But he brought the boy to the 9 because he had expectations. Very soon we will have a congregational meeting and we're going to be talking about expectations. And you need to think about that, the expectations, reasonable expectations that we need to have of one another, reasonable expectations that you think you should have of your leaders, including your pastor, reasonable expectations that you think your pastor and leaders should have of you, reasonable expectations that you think God should have of us, reasonable expectations that we should have of God, and just to complete the circle, reasonable expectations that we should have of one another. Reasonable expectations that we should have of what new life should be in Bellevue, in Nebraska, in America, in the world. We have to talk about that. So you've been served. Always wanted to say that. But for now, this man, distraught to death, with a massive problem on his... It's one thing to have a son. That would be enough. But he has a son who is troubled. Poor fellow. He brings this boy to the 9, the disciples, and what we see is a normal result. It's a normal result. They fail. But we've dealt with that just a moment ago. It's not just a story about human failure, human limitation. It's a story about human expectation. So what do we say about this? What was really the expectation? The man expected, this is the point, it wasn't just any man that the man brought his son to. He brought his son to Jesus' disciples. And the implication is that he expected that these 9 men walking around with Jesus for many months, several months now, given the miracles that Jesus has done, these 9 disciples, apprentices, followers, must be able to do the same. Must be able to do the same. That's the expectation. They expected the 9, they expected the disciples to be able to deal with the problem, but we've already seen that the disciples did not have the ability. They could not. But that doesn't change the fact that there was the expectation. And this is an understandable expectation, don't you see? These are the men who have been with Jesus. These are the men who are learning from Jesus. These are the men who are seeking to be like Jesus. These are the men who are always with Jesus whenever Jesus does any wonderful, grandiose thing. It's an understandable expectation. But it was also an unreasonable expectation. Understandable, but unreasonable. For the simple fact that these men weren't Jesus. One of the greatest things to discover in the Christian life is that we are not God and we are not Jesus. We are Jesus' body, but that's together. But we are not God. So it's an understandable expectation, but an unreasonable one. So there are 2 warnings here before we move on. The first warning is, watch the expectations you have of other people. And the second warning is, of course, watch the expectations you have of your own good self. Watch the expectations you have of others. We live in a world, and just this morning we were I managed to sit through the whole class. I tell you that when we have 2 adult classes with 2 really good things going on, I because of my pastoral freedom, I flipped from class to class because it's so good. I don't know which one to stay, but I stayed in one this morning. It was the one that's studying Galatians. And we reminded ourselves there this morning that our opinions can get us into trouble, but worse, other people's opinions can get us into trouble. And Galatians deals with a group of people who thought that they knew better than the Apostle Paul did, and they set things in motion that could have wrecked the church. And since then until now, there are always people who think they know more than what the apostles know, and who know more than what the rest of the prophets of the church know. So there are some people who will set themselves up to be prophet, this and that. The day you hear me refer to myself as Apostle Michael Friday or Prophet Michael Friday, run as fast as you can and as far away as you could. I am talking about me. I am not talking about anybody else. We've got to be very careful and watch the expectations, because there are some people, some of them appear on our TV, on our cable stations. Some of them are very popular and very famous, and some not so famous. And by the words they say, and by the things they purport to do, and there's some very sleazy things that go on behind what they purport to do, you should read a book that's entitled The Agony of Deceit. And I forget the name of the author. It's a book that was written back in the 80s by a Pentecostal minister who decided to investigate a number of things. That book came out of his postgraduate study. Some of the things I suspected back then, but we're not going there. But we just want to say that you should watch the expectations you have of others. And people come and they try to tell you, I hear directly from God, you know. You have to be careful, because our understanding is that even when somebody has heard directly from God, that is confirmed among the body. And so nobody should walk in here and say, I have heard directly from God, and what I have heard overrules everything you have heard. That's dangerous. Look, we must watch the expectations we have of others. And we must watch the expectations we have of ourselves. That's where it even gets worse. So if you find that you're becoming super spiritual, and I'm more holy than you should run from yourself. If you find yourself gravitating to delusions of grandeur, I can and I will do all things through Christ, I say, who strengthens me. And what you do involves things that don't match the fruit of the Spirit, the work and works of the Spirit. We have a problem, Houston. But, you know, many of us aren't going to go there. I'll tell you where many of us will go. It's where we try to be perfectionist. It's where we try to control everything. It's bad enough when we try to control everything for ourselves, or when we try to control everything for others. You see? Whether low OCD or high OCD, all of those things, we've got to what those grow out of expectations. So don't become a control freak. That's when you become a devil to others. And don't try to be perfect. You're hearing from somebody who's wrestled with perfectionism too long. I think I'm getting better at it. I mean, better at fighting it, that is. Just a public secret. If you sensed how uptight I was towards the end of 2012, and you sense that I'm not that uptight in 2013, it tells you that I did some work. Let go. Forget it. The underbelly of it is, well, if nobody else is worrying about it, why should I worry about it? Gotcha. Look, watch the expectations you have of yourself. Watch the expectations you have of others. And even when we gather as a congregation to talk about expectations, remember that we are all flawed people. It doesn't mean that we all can talk about the expectations and then go away and do our own thing. But we allow for all of us to falter from time to time, but we talk about the expectations that this declares to us. And we as covenant people, agree that we're going to hold to it. And we're forgiving and we're tolerant with one another when we fall. But we're going to have a problem with those who deliberately decide, I'm not going to do it. That would suggest that you're not part of the covenant. Covenant people will decide that these expectations are good because they come from God. And because I am a child of God, I will seek to respond to it. Look, that's another sermon, but for now, this story we read of, I begged your disciples to cast it out, to drive out this demon, but they could not. It's a story about human limitation. And secondly, as we said, it's a story about human expectations. There's a third and final thing it is about. It's a story about human misconception. And the misconception, of course, is implied in the expectation that we just talked about. We said that the expectation that this man had, that these disciples could drive this demon out of his son, was an understandable expectation, but it was an unreasonable one. And therein is the misconception. The misconception is that the disciples could also do everything that Jesus did or does. That, my friends, is a misconception. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. But there are some things that Christ will reserve for himself and himself alone to do because he is Lord of all. And there are some things that God, in his wisdom, will refuse to do a miracle as we count miracles because he's waiting for you, of whom his son said, you will do greater things than this. There's that verse again. We're hearing that verse a lot of times in this congregation in the recent months. So that should tell us something. And not all from me. Could it be that he's waiting on us to act in certain ways? And what we expect of him doesn't happen because we refuse to disabuse our minds of this misconception. Look, let me see if I can make it clearer. I begged your disciples to drive it out, but they could not. And Jesus says, look, I can't deal with you people. When are you going to get it? And what he's talking about is, when will you get it? Why did you not exercise a little bit of patience and wait? I'm just up the hill. And you're asking 9 guys who can't do it. That is what Jesus is saying in verse 41, you know. Oh, unbelieving and perverse generation, how long shall I stay with you and put up with you? Bring your son. This is Jesus responding with a little bit of miffiness. He's a little bit miffed. That these people, never mind it's the beginning of his ministry, don't realize, look, I'm training 12 disciples, yes, but they aren't me. This is the closest that Jesus comes to saying, when will you people get it? That I am he whom God has sent as the deliverer of the world. And you must stop turning to men and you must turn to me. That's the closest he comes to saying that. That's what gets him miffed here. And I think that until now, he's still a little bit disturbed when people turn to people instead of turning to him, especially when the people that turn to people are people like us. Now, this is a difficult thing to preach because we're not saying that we don't have power that is given to us as the body of Christ, right? I mean, the New Testament is replete with that. Galatians and Ephesians will tell us that. Both of them. So if you're not in either of those two classes, it's not too late to join. But what we're saying is that there are some things that only God can do. That's what we're saying. And all the gifts of the Spirit that we read about in Ephesians, all the fruit of the Spirit that we read about in Galatians, and all the body of Christ that we are in the world, and all the greater things than these you will do because I go to the Father and the Spirit is among you, all of those do not trump the truth that there are some things that only God can do until today, and will always be so. And that's what this statement means. I begged your disciples to cast it out, drive it out, but they could not. You know what's the problem here? It's a dual problem. It's a problem of equating Jesus with everybody else. That's what was happening. And that's why Jesus responded gutturally the way he did. That was dangerously hovering near to idolatry. Thou shalt have no other gods before me, and we can make peace. The moment you begin to equate people with Jesus, you see where it's going? The moment you begin to say that, Jesus is like everybody else. Everybody else is like Jesus. And that's not what we mean when we say we want to be like Jesus. It means being Christ-like, not being Christ. So that's the first danger and the first warning. There's the danger of equating Jesus with other people. And the concomitant problem with that is that you exclude Jesus from your problems. So it's one problem with two sides. That's what was happening here when this man, innocently, by the way, I don't think he intended to diss Jesus. Never mind, Jesus came down hard on him and them. I don't think he intended. I think he really was desperate and he brought. And I don't know what the disciples said. I don't know. It is quite possible that the disciples even said, maybe that's why Jesus wasn't rebuking them, but he rebuked them, those who came expecting. Maybe the disciples said, we can't do this, Maybe they declared that up front. Maybe they didn't even try because they knew their limitations. It's possible. But the fact that the man was saying, I begged them, but they could not, suggests that however it went down, the disciples did not because they could not deal with the problem. And we're making the warning that we should not equate Jesus with other people. And the flip side of that is that we should not exclude Jesus from our problems. It's only when Jesus came down the mountain that things began to roll. I suspect that Jesus may have had in mind to say, listen, it's possible that the disciples even said to the man, hang on a bit, Jesus is up the hill. Just give him some time, he'll come down. Remember, you know one of the reasons why that passage from Exodus was read, and is one of the passages along with this one for today. When Moses went up the mountain, what happened? You remember? What's this fellow doing up there so long? He's staying up there as long as Friday stays in the pulpit, or even longer. As for this fellow Moses, we don't know what happened to him. Let's do our own thing. I don't know. I mean, maybe the disciples pleaded with the man and with the whole crowd. Jesus is just up there. Give him some time. We know he hasn't gone to stay. We know he's gone. Just wait a bit. Wait a bit. It's hard. I know it's hard. When somebody is in desperate straits and wants to die, it's hard to tell them, wait. I mean, you've been there. You maybe are there this morning. And when we don't wait is when we make some of the most foolish decisions for life. When Jesus is just no longer up the hill, but he's right within elbow touching distance. Indeed, he's in us. There's that warning. Look, let me bring this to a close. We said that this is Transfiguration Sunday. But what does that mean? What does it, should it mean for us today? We don't need to see Jesus light up like a Christmas tree or something to know that he, who he is. So that's not the point for us today. I mean, he's already lit up. But today, just as then, and maybe today more than then, we need to have our eyes opened so that our understanding and our perspective and our faith, and by extension our behavior, would be changed because we're looking at Jesus alone. How does that work out in today's world? Well, there's a reason that it was Moses and Elijah that appeared, according to the reading in Luke 9, with Jesus. Who was Moses? The deliverer from the oppressor, Egypt. Who was Elijah? The greatest prophet of Israel. Both men, if you remember, knew failure very well. Very, very well. So what do we do with that on Transfiguration Sunday? What's the point for us living normal lives where we will encounter failure? Well, it's this. We don't need to see Jesus lit up, as I just said. We already know that we should listen to Jesus. The reason that Jesus alone remains, and the reason that it is still relevant for us to remember and to hear God saying, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him alone." The Galatians class, you already sense where we're going with this. Because there's too many props that we lean back on along with Jesus. And that's sinful. It is sinful. If you read Galatians, you will know why I say it's sinful. It's dangerous. It denies the lordship of Jesus Christ. All those props. So, watch the Moses that you listen to in your life. All those things that deliver you, the medicines you take, the education you build, the skills and the extracurricular activities that you pursue like crazy to become something or somebody, the opinions you hold, all the things that deliver, the experience I can lean back on, all of those things that deliver, the money I need to make and I will work my soul off to get it, or the loans that I will take, or the credit card debt that I will build up to be delivered. And Dave Ramsey has a different word for that. The philosophies that I hold to, the arguments that I can successfully command arising from those philosophies, all of the things that we rely on for deliverance, the lies that I tell to get out of a hole that I dug for myself by some other prop all of those things are the Moseses that we need to ditch if we're listening to the Son and the Son alone. What about Elijah? We need to ditch Elijah as well. Let no Elijah dazzle you. Elijah was a prophet. How does that translate to us now? All the ambitions, all the plans, all the dreams, all the agendas that you set for your life, and yes, all the expectations you have of how life will go and should go. And I beat myself up and beat others up when it doesn't go that way. All of those prophecies. See, that's what prophecy means in this context. When you sit down with your calendar this evening and you decide how this week will go, that's a prophecy. And you have to ask yourself, how flexible am I to let that go and let the Son and the Son alone speak? So that when Wednesday evening comes, for example, and you look at your agenda, and even if it's empty, especially if it's empty and you're not here, that's a decision. That's a prophecy that you've allowed to speak to you above the word of Jesus. This is my Son. Listen to him. I know you don't like when I do that with scriptures, but that's how it comes to me. And as we say in Jamaica, so I get it, so I give you. Look, we live normal lives where we will encounter failure. And all of those things, the things that I interpreted as the Moseses of life, the things that deliver you, all of those things that I've interpreted as the Elijahs of life, the prophecies you set for yourself, the plans, the dreams, the agendas and all of those things are attended with limitations, don't you see? All of those things are affected by human limitations. A friend of mine wrote me and asked me, what are you doing in October? I need you to do something for me if something. He couldn't even say that the thing was going to happen. It's his 25th year in the ministry. He lives in Florida and he's asking if I would. And I said, my man, it's January. I can't tell you what I'm going to be doing in October. And even if I tell you what I will be, I don't even know if I'm going to be here in October. I could be the late Michael Friday in October, for all I know. I don't know, it might be great. So, look, all of those things are attended by limitations. All of those things smack of expectations. But if you look carefully, all of them are fraught with misconceptions. That's why James says, we shouldn't say, tomorrow I will do so and so. Any of you who have, I don't have my phone on me, but any of you who have that calendar that you flick through electronically now, I don't see anywhere when you punch in the thing and you confirm your date, it says, it adds as a default thing, if the Lord pleases. James says, don't say tomorrow I will do so and so, but say tomorrow if it is the Lord's will. All of those things that we lean on, it is only Jesus who is not fraught with human limitation. It is only Jesus who is not fraught with with dashed expectations. It is only Jesus whom, if we understand properly, is not messed up with human misconception. All of those will trouble us. Only Jesus is unmatched. Only Jesus is unequaled. Only Jesus is unique. Only Jesus can turn our impotence into power. Only Jesus can turn the impossible to possible, not we. Only Jesus can turn failure, human failure, the kind, if you fail to brush your teeth, that could easily be remedied by trying again. So that's not what I'm talking about. I am talking about the things that make us drop to our knees and things that we've been wrestling with since 1960-something that we can't beat. Those things that test us daily. And we want to know, Lord, when will we beat this? We can't. Only Jesus in his time will deal with that. And until then, we must learn what is grace, which is sufficient for us in our weakness means. Only Jesus can do that. Only Jesus, therefore, is Lord of all. Bow with me for a moment. How does this word make impact on you? What is the Spirit saying? What's your attitude to human limitations, your own limitations? What are your expectations and others of you? What are the misconceptions that are throwing a monkey wrench into your living? How do you really view Jesus? Do we lack the humility to acknowledge that we are totally dependent on Him, even though we're His disciples? I want to use the next few moments of quiet to hear the Spirit speaking to you. Let Him answer these questions. Let Him relieve you of some of the anxiety and the angst you carry based on unreasonable expectations. Let Him allow you and help you to cut yourself some slack, because we all have limitations. There's some things we just cannot do. And let Him bring you at last to a reminder that there are some things only He can do. And that a life of success is one in which we join with the other saints, and letting the Spirit work through all of us together to temper us, to educate us, to help us discern what we're called to do and what we must stand back and get out of the way and let God do. So perhaps that issue that is beating you this morning, that you've been fighting all year since the turn of the millennium, 2000, or however far back, that thing that you've been doing everything in your power to fight, maybe you need to stop fighting and just be still. Yes, there's some things you need to put in place. Yes, there's some things you need to do. But stand back. Be still. And let God. Don't be part of the perverse generation that expects of yourself, expects of the rest of us what only God can do. And for goodness sake, don't stand back and wait on God to do what He's given you and us the power to do. Don't mix it up. Father, may your word bring relief, bring a big aha moment to somebody here today, so that they leave this place today free from the bondage of unreasonable expectations they've set for themselves and set for others. Free from the obsessive compulsive disorder that perhaps is one of the biggest devils that makes us convulse and foam at the mouth today. Free from the agendas we set for life, the prophecies we put over our lives that do not have anything to do with what you want of us. Free from the props we create and lean on to deliver us when it is only Jesus who can. Hear our prayer, O Lord, and let our cries come to you. For Jesus' sake. Amen.